The air in the executive suite was kept at a sterile chill, a temperature designed for machines, not people. At 11:55 p.m., the silence was absolute, broken only by the blood rushing in my ears. I stared out at the city lights, dread pooling in my stomach. Then came the sound. The heavy brass lock of the CEO's office disengaging. It sounded like a gunshot. I turned to see Victoria standing in the threshold. I was about to lose the only career that mattered, at the hands of the woman I had been secretly mapping for 2 years. The heavy oak door swung open, framing her against the darkness. Victoria wasn't merely a CEO. She was a localized weather system, a cold front that altered the atmospheric pressure of any room she entered. For the past 24 months, I had existed in her orbit as her lead strategist, a position that required me to interpret her silence as fluently as her directives. She was immaculate composure, a study in grayscale and sharp angles, while I was all kinetic energy and chaotic creativity. The contrast between us should have been a deterrent, a clear signal that we belonged to different species. Instead, it had become a source of friction that I felt in my teeth. The office, a sprawling, high-altitude cage of glass and reinforced steel, had served as a terrifying amplifier for everything we refused to say. It was in the sterile conference rooms where I first noticed the weight of her gaze, heavy and unreadable, lingering on my hands while I presented quarterly projections. It was in the elevator, during those suffocating 30-second descents, where the air would grow thick with ozone and unspoken longing. I remembered a Tuesday last November when our arms had brushed while reaching for the same file. The contact had been brief, incidental, yet the jolt was sharp and electric, leaving a phantom warmth on my skin that lasted for hours. I had cataloged that moment, filed it away in the dark recesses of my mind where I kept the dangerous things. But the corporate world has no patience for the abstract cartography of desire. It demands efficiency, and tonight, I was the inefficiency being corrected. The summons had come via a calendar invite sent 3 hours ago, citing a discrepancy in the Asia-Pacific merger data. It was a pretext so flimsy it felt almost insulting. The error was minor, a rounding difference in the third decimal place that any junior analyst could have rectified in a single apologetic email. We both knew this meeting wasn't about numbers or spreadsheets. The data was just the weapon she had chosen to wield, a clean, bureaucratic knife to sever the tether between us. I looked at her now, standing by the mahogany desk that served as her fortress. She wore a charcoal suit that looked tailored to intimidate, her hair pulled back in a severe style that exposed the sharp line of her jaw. There was no warmth in her posture, no hint of the woman who had once let her guard down enough to laugh at a terrible joke I made during a Christmas gala. That version of her felt like a hallucination. The woman in front of me was the Ice Queen, a moniker the junior staff whispered in the break room, though they never saw the loneliness that lived behind the frost. She didn't speak immediately. She simply watched me, her eyes dark and formidable, stripping away my defenses until I felt exposed, raw. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, vibrating with the static of 1,000 things we couldn't say because HR policies and the instinct for self-preservation stood in the way. I wanted to scream, to demand the truth, to ask if she felt the same magnetic pull that was currently tearing me apart. Instead, I stood paralyzed, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. Finally, she moved. It was a small, efficient gesture, a slight inclination of her head toward the leather chair opposite her desk. Her face remained unreadable, a mask of porcelain and resolve that offered no quarter. She was inviting me to my own execution, and God help me, I was grateful just to be in the room with her. I walked forward, my legs feeling heavy and foreign, and took the seat. The leather was cold against my back. "Miss Reynolds," she began. The use of my surname was a physical blow. Her voice was a low contralto, a sound that usually commanded boardrooms, but now seemed to vibrate against the very walls of the office. It was rich, dark, and terrifyingly composed. I focused on the desk between us to keep from unraveling. It was a vast expanse of polished mahogany, devoid of anything human. There were no framed photographs, no trinkets, no evidence of a life lived outside these walls. Just a single, expensive fountain pen resting on a leather-bound folio. In the high-gloss finish of the wood, I saw my own reflection, distorted, pale, eyes wide with a fear I couldn't mask. "We need to discuss the trajectory of your role here," she said. She didn't blink. Her hands were folded on the desk, perfectly still. "I have reviewed the operational efficiency reports for the last quarter. While your creative output is notable, there is a fundamental misalignment with the corporate restructuring we are implementing." The words were sterile, corporate jargon designed to sanitize the act of destruction. Misalignment, restructuring. She was listing professional incompatibilities with surgical precision, dissecting my 2 years of sleepless nights and breakthrough strategies as if they were merely data points on a failed graph. But the reasons didn't fit. My department was the highest performing sector. We both knew this was a lie. A hollowing out began in my stomach. A cold, expanding void that threatened to swallow me whole. It wasn't just the loss of the job. I could find another job. It was the realization that she was doing this. The woman who had once held my gaze across a crowded room for 3 seconds too long was now discarding me like a redundant server. The pain wasn't professional. It was personal. A sharp ache that centered behind my ribs. "Victoria," I said, the name slipping out before I could stop it. A breach of protocol. "The numbers don't support this. My team is up 40%. The merger data error was a glitch. I can fix it in 5 minutes." "It is not about the error," she interrupted, her voice sharpening, slicing through my defense. "It is about sustainability. And this arrangement is no longer sustainable." The word arrangement hung in the air, heavy and ambiguous. Was she talking about my contract, or the unspoken, suffocating tension that had defined our existence for the last year? The ache in my chest solidified into a sharp physical pain. I felt like I was bleeding out, yet there wasn't a mark on me. "I don't understand," I whispered, and I hated the tremor in my voice. It betrayed me. It wasn't the voice of a lead strategist fighting for her position. It was the voice of a woman watching her sanctuary burn down. "I have given everything to this company, to you." That was the mistake. The personalization. The admission that my loyalty wasn't to the logo on the door, but to the person sitting behind the desk. Victoria flinched. It was microscopic, a tiny tightening at the corner of her eye, but I saw it. For a fraction of a second, the porcelain mask cracked, revealing something frantic underneath. But then the walls slammed back down, higher and colder than before. "The decision is final," she said, her tone finality itself. She picked up the fountain pen, capping it with a decisive click that echoed like a gavel. "Severance has been arranged. It is generous." She couldn't look at me anymore. The intimacy of my devastation was too much, even for her. She stood up abruptly, the motion sharp and jagged, breaking the stillness she usually commanded so effortlessly. She turned away from the desk, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the sleeping city. She presented her back to me, a rigid line of tension in a charcoal suit, silhouetted against the indifferent lights of the skyline. She was shutting me out, physically and emotionally, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my career and the ghost of a relationship that never even had the chance to breathe. The atmosphere in the room shifted, transforming from the sterile vacuum of a corporate execution into something volatile. The air grew heavy, charged with the static of things unsaid, the molecules seemingly rearranging themselves into a configuration that felt dangerous. It was the feeling of a storm front moving in, the drop in barometric pressure that precedes the violence of thunder. She spoke to the glass, addressing the ghost of herself in the window rather than the woman sitting behind her. "I cannot have you in this building anymore." Her voice had dropped an octave. It had lost its polished boardroom sheen, replaced by a timbre that was raw, low, and terrifyingly human. It wasn't a command issued from the top of the org chart. It was a confession wrestled from the dark. "Victoria," I started, but the name died in my throat as she finally turned away from the view. The Ice Queen was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. The immaculate composure had fractured, revealing an exhaustion so deep it looked painful. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a hunger. It was dark, desperate, and it was directed entirely at me. The look in her eyes wasn't the dismissal of a subordinate. It was the look of someone starving who had just been offered a feast they were forbidden to touch. The formidable armor she wore like a second skin had dissolved, leaving her exposed. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking slightly on the last syllable. She took a step away from the window, her hands unclenching at her sides. "I am not firing you because you are incompetent. I am firing you because I can no longer function while you are here." The world tilted on its axis. The narrative I had constructed, of my failure, of her indifference, shattered into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. "The error in the report," she continued, the words tumbling out now, faster, less controlled. "It was irrelevant. I needed the contract to end. I needed the HR barrier to be gone. As long as you are my employee, you are off limits. You are a liability. You are..." She stopped, swallowing hard, her throat working against the tightness of her collar. "You are the only thing I can see." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a punishment. It was a surgical removal of the obstacle standing between us. She wasn't discarding me. She was setting me free from the rules that kept her from me. The devastation that had been hollowing out my chest transmuted instantly into a confused, pounding hope. It was a terrifying alchemy. The woman who controlled a global empire was dismantling her own team, risking a wrongful termination lawsuit, risking her reputation, just to clear the space between us. "You're firing me," I breathed, the words tasting like ash and sugar. So I don't have to be your boss anymore," she finished. The admission hung in the air, stark and undeniable. The silence that followed wasn't sterile. It was loud, filled with the sound of 2 years of repressed longing suddenly finding a way to breathe. The cage of glass and steel hadn't just amplified our connection. It had been the only thing keeping us safe from it. And she had just unlocked the door. She began to walk toward me. It wasn't the confident stride of a CEO marching to a podium. It was slower, deliberate, prowling. The sound of her heels sinking into the plush carpet marked a countdown. Every step she took eroded the professional distance we had maintained with such agonizing care. 10 feet. 6 feet. The air around me seemed to compress, the scent of her, sandalwood and cold rain, drifting ahead of her like a warning. She was coming to claim the space she had just purchased with my severance package. She stopped inches from my chair, close enough that the expensive wool of her trousers brushed against my knee. It was a contact so illicit it made my breath hitch. Up close, the mythology of the Ice Queen dissolved into high-definition reality. I could see the faint human tremor in her hands, the rapid dilation of her pupils that swallowed the iris until her eyes were almost entirely black. Her perfume, a complex layering of sandalwood and something sharp, like cold rain on pavement, flooded my senses. It was a scent I had only ever caught in passing, a ghost in the elevator. But now it was heavy, overwhelming, the only thing I could breathe. "Do you understand?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried more weight than any directive she had ever issued. "Do you understand why this had to happen?" The question hung between us, suspended in the thick electric silence. I looked up at her, my neck craning back. The position was intolerable, me seated, trapped in the furniture of my subordination, while she loomed above me. It was the posture of the employee, and that dynamic had supposedly ended 30 seconds ago when she signed the paper on her desk. I stood up. The movement was sudden, a reclamation of agency. We were close in height, and for the first time in 2 years, I looked her directly in the eye without the filter of deference. The shift in perspective was dizzying. I wasn't looking up at a pedestal anymore. I was looking across at a woman who was terrified of what she was about to do. "You fired me," I said, my voice steady despite the jackhammer rhythm of my heart. "You ended my career tonight." "I cleared the board," she corrected, her gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. "I removed the rules. There is no HR department in this room anymore." She reached out. The movement was slow, giving me time to pull away, to storm out. I didn't move. I was rooted to the spot by a gravity that had been pulling at me since my first day. Her fingers grazed my jawline. The contact was a shock to the system. Thermal shock. Her skin was cool, smooth as the marble in the lobby, while my face felt like it was burning with a fever. She traced the line of my cheekbone with a reverence that felt blasphemous in this office. This was the hand that signed billion-dollar mergers, the hand that had just signed my dismissal, now cupping my face as if I were something fragile and precious. "You're burning," she murmured, her thumb brushing over the pulse point in my neck. "You're freezing," I countered, my voice barely audible. "I've been cold for a long time," she admitted. The power dynamic hadn't disappeared. It hadn't evaporated with my job title. It had simply transmuted, changing states like water to steam. It was no longer the sterile authority of a CEO over a strategist. It was the ancient, terrifying power of someone who holds your emotional survival in their hands. She still held the power, not because she signed the checks, but because she was the only person who could stop the ache that had been hollowing me out. She stepped closer, invading the last centimeter of my personal space until our chests were almost touching. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, contradicting the coolness of her hands. The office, the panoramic view, the mahogany desk, the awards, faded into the periphery. The world narrowed down to the space between us. Then came the sound that sealed our fate. It wasn't a word. It was a mechanical click. Without breaking eye contact, she had reached behind her to the heavy door. She turned the lock. The sound echoed in the silence, a definitive punctuation mark. We were locked in. The rest of the building, the laws of the corporate world, they were all on the other side. In here, there was only this. The click of the lock was the last coherent mechanical sound I heard for a long time. It acted as a detonator. The space between us, that charged, impossible distance we'd maintained with agonizing discipline for 24 months, collapsed in a single breath. She didn't just kiss me. She crashed into me. It was a collision of two celestial bodies that had been orbiting each other in a decaying trajectory until gravity finally won. Her hands were in my hair instantly, gripping tight, dragging me down to meet her. The first touch of her lips wasn't tentative. There was no hesitation, no testing of the waters to see if the temperature was safe. It was desperate, a starving thing finally being fed. I tasted the expensive scotch she must have had to steel herself for the firing. I tasted the sharp tang of mint she used to hide it. But mostly, I tasted the sheer, terrifying force of her need. This was the woman who negotiated hostile takeovers without blinking, who stared down shareholders with ice in her veins, and she was unraveling in my hands. The sound she made, a low, broken noise in the back of her throat, shattered me. It was the sound of the Ice Queen melting, the sound of a fortress crumbling into the sea. My hands found purchase on the lapels of her charcoal blazer, bunching the expensive fabric in my fists. I wanted to tear the corporate armor off her, to find the person buried underneath the title and the expectations. I pushed her back, and she went willingly, her back hitting the edge of the mahogany desk, the same desk where she had just terminated my employment. She didn't care. She swept the leather-bound folio aside with a blind sweep of her arm. The sound of the heavy papers, my severance agreement, my non-compete clauses, hitting the floor was lost in the rush of our breathing. She hoisted herself up onto the wood, pulling me between her legs, erasing the height difference, erasing the hierarchy. The office, with its panoramic view of the sleeping city and its awards for corporate excellence, dissolved into a blur of shadow and light. The only reality was the friction of wool against silk, the heat of her skin, and the desperate way she held on to me. Her hands were everywhere, cool fingers mapping the heat of my face, tracing the line of my throat, possessive and frantic. This wasn't just physical. If it were just sex, I could have handled it. I could have categorized it as a stress response, a momentary lapse. But this was a confession. Every touch was an apology for the silence, for the cold stares in the boardroom, for the months of pretending I was just a line item in a budget. She was speaking a language I had been trying to decode for years, and the translation was devastating. I am lonely. I am terrified. I need you. The control she wielded over the company, over the market, over me, it was all gone. In this moment, she wasn't the CEO. She was just Victoria. And she was drowning. I realized with a jolt that I was the raft. I kissed her jaw, her neck, feeling the frantic pulse hammering beneath the skin. She arched into the touch, a gasp escaping her lips that sounded like my name. "I thought," she whispered, her voice wrecked, breathless against my ear. "I thought if I let you go, the wanting would stop." "You were wrong," I murmured against her skin. "I know," she breathed. "God, I know." She pulled me back up to her mouth, silencing any further analysis. The kiss deepened, becoming slower, heavier. It was a claiming. The sterile air of the office, usually so cold and recycled, felt thick and tropical. We were desecrating the sanctuary of her authority, turning the seat of her power into the landscape of our intimacy. I ran my hands down her back, feeling the tension in her muscles, the rigid posture she maintained for the world, finally giving way to softness. Time dissolved. I don't know how long we stayed like that, a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing in the center of the darkened executive suite. The city lights outside continued to blink their indifferent codes, but inside, the world had fundamentally changed. The storm eventually began to recede, not disappearing, but settling into a deep, aching closeness. We slowed down, the desperate, frantic energy transmuting into a heavy, tangled silence. My forehead rested against hers, our breathing synchronizing in the quiet room. Her hands were still on my face, her thumbs stroking my cheekbones with a reverence that made my chest ache. I opened my eyes. She was watching me, her pupils blown wide, her lips swollen and red. The mask was gone completely. The digital clock on the wall flickered, the red numbers cutting through the gloom. 1 a.m. The witching hour had passed. The reality of what we had done, and what it meant for the morning that was rapidly approaching, began to seep back in like cold air under a doorframe. We were still locked in, but the world was waiting outside. And I was still fired. The return to the physical world was violent in its banality. We didn't speak as we untangled ourselves. The silence that filled the room now wasn't the heavy, charged static of before, but something brittle and strange. I watched her button her charcoal blazer with hands that had stopped trembling, witnessing the terrifying efficiency with which she reconstructed her armor. In under 2 minutes, the woman who had been unraveling in my arms vanished, replaced once again by the CEO. She smoothed her hair, adjusted her cuffs, and the transformation was so complete it felt like a magic trick, or a betrayal. I stood there, feeling unmoored, my own blouse hastily tucked in, my skin still burning with the phantom sensation of her touch. The office looked different now. The the desk wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore. It was a site of memory, a landscape we had altered. But Victoria didn't look at the desk. She walked behind it, opened a locked drawer, and pulled out a second leather folder. "Here," she said. Her voice was steady, the low contralto back in place, though it lacked the sharp edge it held 2 hours ago. I took the folder. Inside was a contract. It wasn't a standard severance agreement. It was a consultancy retainer. My eyes scanned the legal jargon: independent contractor, strategic advisor, direct reporting line to the CEO. The date on the draft was from yesterday. The realization hit me harder than the firing had. She hadn't just acted on impulse. She hadn't lost control in the moment. She had planned this. She had orchestrated my termination and my resurrection simultaneously. She had calculated the exact legal loophole required to keep me close without breaking the company's fraternization policy. It was brilliant. It was manipulative. And it was terrifying. "You planned this," I said, looking up from the paper. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you called me in here." "I knew I couldn't keep you as an employee," she replied, her eyes finally meeting mine. They were dark, unreadable again, but the hunger was still there, buried deep beneath the surface. And I knew I couldn't let you go. This was the only architectural solution. Architectural solution. She spoke of our lives like they were structural problems to be engineered. I signed it. I didn't even hesitate. I signed away my benefits, my job security, and my tenure for a contract that offered me nothing but access to her. The safety net of the employee handbook was gone. There was no HR department to protect me from this dynamic now. I was technically unemployed, yet personally entangled in a way that felt far more permanent than any employment contract. We left the building separately. That was the rule. She waited 10 minutes after I walked out the door. The elevator ride down was a suffocating descent into reality. The security guard in the lobby nodded to me as I signed out, unaware that the woman leaving the building was a completely different entity than the one who had entered it. The drive home was a blur of sodium streetlights and confusion. The city looked different through the windshield, sharper, more hostile. I was an outsider now. I had been exiled from the kingdom, only to be given a secret key to the queen's private chambers. The isolation of the car felt heavy. I turned off the radio, needing the silence to process the sensory overload of the last hour. My body felt heavy, rewired, humming with a frequency that hadn't been there this morning. I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment as the sun bleached the sky gray, watching the morning news with a cup of cold coffee in my hand. And there she was. At 7 a.m., Victoria was on CNBC, discussing the Asian-Pacific merger. She looked immaculate, formidable, the Ice Queen in high definition. Her voice was crisp, her logic unassailable. I stared at the screen, trying to reconcile the image with the memory of her breath hitching against my neck, the taste of scotch and desperation on her lips. It felt like a hallucination. How could she compartmentalize so effectively? How could she sever the woman in the office from the woman on the screen? Then my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a single text message from a number I hadn't saved but knew by heart. "Review the brief. I need your thoughts on the acquisition strategy by noon, and bring the coffee I like." It was coded, professional on the surface, but the subtext was screaming. "Come back. You're mine. We aren't done." I looked at the TV, then at the phone. The fear was still there, the uncertainty of this new shadow arrangement. But as I read the message again, the cold knot in my stomach loosened, replaced by that dangerous, pounding hope. I wasn't her employee anymore. I was her secret. And God help me, that felt like a promotion. The new architecture of our lives was built entirely on shadows. My badge no longer opened the main doors of the headquarters. Instead, I had a key fob that granted access to the private elevator of her penthouse. The transition from lead strategist to external consultant was supposed to be a demotion in status, but in reality, it was an elevation in intimacy. We had created a clandestine world, a pocket universe that existed only between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. The routine became a dangerous addiction. By day, I worked from coffee shops or my apartment, drafting strategies that I would email to her encrypted server. The subject lines were always mundane: Q3 projections, risk assessment protocols. But we both knew they were digital love letters, coded signals that meant, "I am thinking of you," or "come home soon." By night, the professional facade dissolved. In the sanctuary of her penthouse, away from the glass walls of the office, the Ice Queen melted into something softer, something almost domestic. We would sit on her Italian leather sofa, reviewing the briefs I had prepared, but her hand would rest on my ankle, her thumb tracing the bone in a rhythmic, hypnotic motion that made it impossible to focus on market shares. But the daylight hours were a torture I hadn't anticipated. Being an outsider meant I had to watch her navigate the shark tank of the industry from the sidelines. I attended the Global Tech Summit 2 weeks later, wearing a generic guest lanyard that felt like a brand of shame. I watched from the back of the auditorium as she commanded the stage, her voice projecting that familiar, terrifying authority. She was magnificent and untouchable. When she descended the stairs, surrounded by a phalanx of board members and sycophants, she looked right through me. It was a necessary performance, a calculated omission of acknowledgement to protect the lie we were living, but it felt like being fired all over again. The thrill of the secret began to curdle into paranoia. The industry was small, and eyes were everywhere. It started with a comment from Julian Sterling, a senior board member with a shark's smile and a predator's instinct for weakness. He cornered me at the buffet, swirling his scotch with a suspicion that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You're doing a lot of specialized consulting for Victoria lately," he murmured, his eyes flicking toward where she stood across the room. "Expensive hours. One might wonder what kind of strategy requires such late-night billing." I managed a non-committal answer, but the ice in my stomach returned. He didn't accuse, he implied. And in our world, implication was a weapon. I wasn't just a consultant. I was a liability. I was the hairline fracture in the diamond of her reputation. If they found out, they wouldn't just fire her. They would destroy her legacy. Victoria sensed the danger before I even spoke a word. Her reaction was immediate and suffocating. She began to wall me off, not from her bed, but from the work. She canceled our scheduled debriefs at the office, insisting we only meet at the apartment. She redacted my name from reports I had written. She was trying to build a fortress around me, to shield me from the Julian Sterlings of the world. But it didn't feel like protection. It felt like I was being erased. The control she had surrendered that night in her office was creeping back in, disguised as safety. She was terrified of losing the company, yes, but she was more terrified of the world touching what she considered hers. The threat materialized on a Tuesday morning, not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of a courier packet delivered to my apartment. Inside was a cease and desist draft regarding proprietary information and a copy of a board memo questioning undisclosed third-party expenditures. It was Julian Sterling's handwriting. It wasn't an audit. It was a warning shot aimed directly at Victoria's head, using me as the bullet. Victoria didn't summon me to the penthouse that night. She met me in a neutral public park, a space so open it felt like an interrogation room without walls. She wore dark sunglasses that hid her eyes, and the Ice Queen armor was back, reinforced with titanium. She stood with her back to the pond, her posture rigid, a statue of cold resolve. "We need to suspend the contract," she said. There was no preamble, no softening of the blow. Sterling is building a case. If they find a link beyond professional advisory, if they find a single text message, a single overnight stay, they will use it to trigger a vote of no confidence. She was doing it again. She was firing me. But this time, she wasn't looking at me with that terrifying, raw hunger. She was looking at the horizon with a desperate determination. She was cutting off the limb to save the body. "It is for your own protection," she added, the phrase tasting like metallic ash in the air between us. "I cannot let you be collateral damage in a boardroom coup." 2 months ago, I would have accepted it. I would have taken the severance, the shame, and the silence. I would have disappeared into the background like a good little strategist. But I knew the texture of her fear now. I knew the sound of her breathing at 3 a.m. when the armor was stripped away. I wasn't an employee anymore, and I refused to be dismissed like one. "No," I said. She froze. The word was foreign to her vocabulary, an anomaly she couldn't process. She turned to face me, the sunglasses sliding down her nose just enough to reveal the shock in her eyes. "Excuse me?" I said no. "You don't get to fire me twice, Victoria. Not to save yourself. And certainly not to save me." We finished the argument in the penthouse. The neutral ground of the park was too exposed for the violence of this conversation. In the safety of her living room, stripped of the public persona, the cracks began to show. She paced the length of the floor, a caged tiger, her movements sharp and jagged. "You don't understand the stakes," she hissed, her voice rising, losing that controlled contralto that terrified subordinates. "This isn't a game. This is my legacy. If they find out, they will strip me of everything I have built. I am trying to shield you from the fallout." "You aren't shielding me," I countered, my voice steady, cutting through her panic. "You're hiding. You think this isolation makes you strong? You think pushing everyone away makes you invulnerable?" I stepped into her path, forcing her to stop, forcing her to look at me. "It doesn't make you powerful, Victoria. It just makes you lonely. And you have been lonely for so long, you've forgotten the difference." The words hit her like a physical strike. She flinched, her breath hitching in a way that was devastatingly familiar. The anger drained out of her instantly, leaving only a terrified exhaustion. She slumped onto the Italian leather sofa, the fight leaving her body as if I had cut her strings. "It's not the company," she whispered, looking up at me, her eyes wet and unguarded. "I can survive losing the company. I can build another one. But I cannot survive losing this." She gestured between us, a frantic, helpless wave of her hand. "The sanctuary, the quiet. If they drag this into the light, they will destroy it. They will make it dirty, and I can't let them touch you." The realization washed over me. She wasn't protecting her legacy. She was protecting us. But she was using the only tools she knew: walls, secrets, and distance. She was willing to burn her own happiness to keep the world from tainting it. "They can't destroy it," I said, kneeling in front of her, taking her cold hands in mine. "Unless we let them. The only way we lose is if we keep hiding until there's nothing left to hide." She looked at me, the fear warring with something else, a dawn of understanding. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of a decision being made, the kind of decision that burns bridges to light the way forward. She squeezed my hands, her grip desperate and firm. We weren't going back to the shadows. We were going to step into the light, and we were going to dare them to look away. We didn't sleep. The vulnerability of the couch was packed away, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful machinery of her intellect. If they wanted a war, Victoria would give them a masterclass in strategy. We spent the remaining hours of darkness mapping the battlefield. She didn't try to bury the secret anymore. She weaponized it. We constructed a narrative that made the conflict of interest look like a deliberate, high-level restructuring for the company's benefit. It was a calculus of absolute transparency that left no shadows for Sterling to hide in. The board meeting the next morning was a study in atmospheric pressure. The air in the conference room was thin, recycled, and smelled of stale coffee and ambition. Julian Sterling sat at the head of the table, his file of accusations resting under his hand like a loaded gun. He looked smug, a predator who thought he had cornered his prey. But he had forgotten that he was hunting a woman who breathed ice. Victoria didn't wait for him to speak. She stood up, her silhouette sharp against the morning light streaming through the glass, the same light that had exposed us hours ago. She didn't look defensive. She looked bored. She opened the meeting not with a defense, but with a disclosure statement. She laid out the timeline, the consultancy agreement, and the nature of our relationship with a clinical detachment that made it sound as inevitable as gravity. She stripped the affair of its scandalous heat and presented it as a solved equation. The conflict of interest has been identified, managed, and neutralized through the consultancy framework, she said, her voice filling the room, leaving no space for interruption. She looked directly at Sterling. My judgment is not compromised, Julian. It is clarified. If you wish to challenge my leadership based on my private life, you may do so. But you will do it knowing that my quarterly returns are the highest in this company's history. Do we want to discuss profits, or do we want to discuss gossip? The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a coup dying in the cradle. Sterling looked at the file under his hand, then at the faces of the other board members. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at her, reminded of exactly who kept their stock prices high. The scandal fizzled out because she refused to feed it with shame. Shame is the oxygen of controversy, and she had sucked the room dry. When we walked out of that room, the dynamic had shifted one final time. We weren't hiding in the elevator anymore. We walked through the main lobby together. The whispers were there, certainly. The corporate ecosystem thrives on rumor. But they didn't matter. The fear that had turned the office into a cage had evaporated. Victoria was still the Ice Queen. She was still formidable, sharp-edged, and terrifying to those who didn't know her. But the ice was no longer a wall built to keep me out. It was a lens, a prism through which we both viewed the world. It was a protective layer that we stood behind, together. She looked at me as we reached the executive suite, and for the first time in public, her expression softened. It wasn't a smile. Victoria didn't smile for the sake of it, but it was a relaxation of the eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the partnership we had forged in the fire. We stood by the window in her office, the same spot where she had fired me. The city was awake now, a sprawling grid of chaos and commerce below us. But the dread was gone. The silence between us wasn't heavy with things unsaid. It was light, breathable. It was the silence of understanding. We had burned down the old architecture of our relationship to build something that could actually stand the weight of the truth. It took 3 months for the executive suite to finally lose its memory of dread. The temperature was still kept at a machine-friendly chill. Victoria functioned best in the cold. But the atmosphere had fundamentally altered. It was 10 p.m. on a Thursday, a time slot that used to be reserved for my panic attacks and existential crises. Now, it was simply the quiet coda to the day. The silence that filled the room wasn't the pressurized vacuum of a waiting room. It was the comfortable, lived-in quiet of a shared life. The scent of ozone and fear had been replaced by the dark roast coffee Victoria insisted on brewing herself, a rich aroma that made the sterile space feel almost like a home. I sat in one of the leather guest chairs, the same chair where I had received my termination notice. But my posture was entirely different. I was no longer a subordinate bracing for impact. I was a partner reviewing a merger brief, my laptop balanced precariously on my knees. Across from me, Victoria had abandoned the fortress of her chair. She was sitting on top of the mahogany desk, a flagrant violation of the corporate decorum she enforced with such rigor during the day. She had kicked off her heels, her stockinged feet were resting in my lap, her toes pressing rhythmically against my thigh as she read through a contract. The intimacy of the gesture was staggering in its banality. This was the woman who had once terrified me with a single raised eyebrow, now using me as a human footrest while she decided the fate of a subsidiary. The Ice Queen persona was still there. I had watched her eviscerate a lazy VP of marketing just 6 hours ago. But it was a coat she took off when the door locked. There is a specific fear that comes with the end of a forbidden romance. You worry that the passion is structural, that it relies on the load-bearing walls of secrecy and risk to stay standing. We had both been terrified that without the HR violations and the clandestine meetings, the electricity would dissipate into a mundane friendship. But the reality was sharper. The work of building a real relationship, of mapping the internal emotional cartography of another person without the distortion of shadows, was far more intense than the sneaking around had ever been. The office had transformed. It was no longer a cage of glass and reinforced steel designed to amplify our unstated longing. It had become a command center, a neutral ground where our ambitions could run parallel instead of colliding. The city lights below didn't look like indifferent spectators anymore. They looked like an audience we had conquered. Victoria sighed, a sound of frustration directed at the document in her hand, and capped her fountain pen. The click echoed in the room, the same sound that had once signaled the end of my career. She looked up, her gaze drifting from the paper to the heavy oak door, then back to me. "I hated that night," she said, her voice dropping to that low, resonant timbre that still made my pulse spike. "The night I fired you, it felt like I was performing an amputation on myself without anesthesia." "It was necessary surgery," I replied, running my thumb along the arch of her foot, feeling the tension leave her frame. "You had to break the bone to reset it properly. If you hadn't done it, we would still be suffocating in the elevator." She looked at me, her eyes dark and serious, stripping away the humor. "I took a statistical impossibility," she murmured. "The risk assessment was terrible. You could have walked out that door and sued me. You could have left and never looked back." "I couldn't," I admitted, meeting her gaze. "The gravity was too strong. I was already in orbit." She smiled, a small, private expression that she hoarded like gold. It was the acknowledgement that the most dangerous decision of her career had been the only logical choice. I stood up, displacing her feet gently, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The glass, which had once reflected a solitary, terrified figure against the skyline, now held the image of two silhouettes merging into one. We had taken a room built for power and turned it into a sanctuary, trading the safety of silence for the terrifying grace of being understood. If you want to hear more stories about the risks we take for the people who captivate us, make sure you subscribe.